A landlord smirks as he dismisses a polite, towering man in a hoodie, muttering, "This place isn't for people like you." Little did he know, the man he just shamed was about to turn his entire world upside down. This wasn't just any tenant. This was Big Shaq, and he had a plan that would shock the entire community. Big Shaq walked into the lavish apartment complex with a sense of hope. It was a breezy afternoon, and he'd finally found time in his packed schedule to secure a place for his visiting family. Dressed in a simple hoodie and basketball shorts, Shaq wasn't aiming to impress anyone. He just wanted a comfortable, welcoming home for the people he loved. The complex was impressive. Marble floors that gleamed under soft lighting, towering ceilings, and pristine decor. Each corner screamed luxury. Shaq marveled at the space, imagining his nieces and nephews running around in the courtyard. But his moment of peace was short-lived. Behind the polished counter stood Mr. Grayson, the complex's landlord. Middle-aged with an expensive suit and a perpetually smug expression, Grayson watched Shaq approach. His sharp eyes scanned Shaq's attire, his lips curling into a subtle smirk. "Can I help you?" Grayson asked, the disdain in his voice evident. "Yes, I'm here to inquire about a 3-bedroom unit," Shaq replied politely, maintaining his calm demeanor. Grayson raised an eyebrow. "3 bedrooms?" he repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism. He glanced down at his tablet, tapping it lazily. "We're fully booked. And even if we weren't, I'm not sure these apartments would fit your budget." Shaq froze for a moment. He'd faced judgment before, but something about Grayson's tone was sharper, more cutting. "I'd still like to see the listings," Shaq said, his voice steady. Grayson chuckled, loud enough for others in the lobby to hear. "Sure, I'll let you look if you're serious about renting, but these aren't entry-level apartments, if you catch my drift." A couple standing nearby exchanged glances, the discomfort on their faces evident. One woman whispered to her partner, shaking her head at Grayson's blatant prejudice. Shaq, however, kept his composure. He leaned forward slightly, meeting Grayson's gaze. "I'm serious," he said simply. Grayson sighed theatrically, stepping away to fetch a brochure. "Fine," he muttered, returning with a folder. "Here's what we offer. But let me save you some time. The units start at $5,000 a month. That's before utilities and fees." Shaq took the brochure with a calm smile. "Thanks for letting me know," he said, ignoring the heat rising in his chest. As Shaq walked toward the door, Grayson called out, "Good luck out there, buddy." The words echoed in the pristine lobby, dripping with mockery. Shaq paused at the exit, turning back briefly. "Thanks," he said, his voice steady. "I make my own luck." The doors closed behind him, but the sting of the encounter lingered. Shaq's grip tightened on the brochure, and a quiet determination settled in his heart. Grayson had no idea who he just underestimated, and Shaq intended to show him. Shaq sat in his car, the brochure still clutched in his hand. The laughter, the snide remarks, they played over and over in his mind. It wasn't the first time someone had judged him by appearances. It wasn't the first time someone assumed he didn't belong. But today, it stung differently. He glanced at the luxury complex one last time through his windshield. $5,000 a month? He murmured to himself. If only he knew. A small, knowing smile played on his lips, but it quickly disappeared. Shaq wasn't the type to let anger take over, but he believed in making things right. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It was his business manager, Colin, calling about an upcoming endorsement deal. Shaq answered, his voice calm. "Hey, Colin, can we talk about that real estate investment project? I have an idea." Colin paused for a moment. "Sure, Shaq. What's going on?" Shaq leaned back in his seat, his massive frame almost too big for the car. "I just walked into this apartment complex, got disrespected by the landlord. Guy acted like I couldn't afford a parking spot, let alone a unit." "That bad?" Colin asked, his tone shifting to concern. "Worse," Shaq replied, his voice steady but firm. "I don't want to just let it slide. Let's find out if this guy owns the whole place or if he's just running it. I want to know who's really in charge." Shaq hung up the phone and exhaled deeply. He wasn't the kind of person to seek revenge. He'd been raised better than that. His mother always taught him that respect was earned, not demanded. But this was about more than just him. How many others had walked into that lobby, hopeful and excited, only to be dismissed by someone like Grayson? The next day, Colin called back with an update. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "The complex is owned by a larger property group, but the owner's looking to sell. They've had financial issues, mismanagement, tenant complaints, maintenance delays. The place is basically up for grabs." Shaq smiled to himself. "Perfect," he said simply. For the next week, Shaq worked quietly but relentlessly. Between meetings and commitments, he dug into the property's history, learning about its operations and its struggles. Colin arranged meetings with lawyers, real estate agents, and investors. Shaq wanted to make sure everything was airtight before he made his move. During this time, Shaq thought often about his mother. He remembered the nights she worked long hours to keep a roof over their heads. He remembered how she treated everyone with kindness, no matter their job or status. "This isn't just about me," Shaq told Colin during one of their calls. "If I do this, I want to give back to the people who really need it." Finally, the day came. The deal was on the table. With the stroke of a pen, Shaq became the majority owner of the complex Grayson had so smugly guarded. The moment was surreal, but Shaq didn't celebrate just yet. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and thought about the next steps. "This isn't about kicking someone out or rubbing it in their face," he told himself. "It's about creating something better." The plan was in motion. All that was left now was the reveal, and Shaq intended to make it unforgettable. Shaq leaned back in his chair, staring at the scribbled notes in front of him. The words "do something meaningful" circled at the center of the page. The humiliation from Grayson still stung, but Shaq wasn't one to dwell on anger. He'd rather act. As he looked at Keisha sitting across from him, her arms folded, eyebrows raised in skepticism, he spoke firmly. "I'm going to buy the complex, Keisha." Her jaw dropped. "The entire complex? Are you serious?" Shaq nodded. "Why not? That man has no right to treat anyone the way he does. If I own it, I can make it a place where everyone feels like they belong." Keisha sighed and rubbed her temples. "Shaq, that's, bold. Do you even know how much it'll cost? The repairs alone could be insane." "I've got the resources," Shaq said, leaning forward, his voice calm yet determined. "And I've got a reason. Grayson's not just cruel, he's neglectful. Those tenants deserve better." Keisha paused, searching his face for any sign of hesitation. She didn't find any. Finally, she cracked a small smile. "All right, I'm in. But this better not be another one of your big ideas that fizzles out halfway." Shaq wasn't going to do this alone. He knew he needed allies, people who believed in community-driven projects. That's where Marcus came in, an old college friend turned real estate consultant. Shaq and Keisha met him at a small cafe the next day, laying out the plan. Marcus listened intently as Shaq explained his vision. "We pitch this as more than a business deal. It's a transformation, a chance to turn that place into a model for inclusive and dignified living," Shaq said, his voice steady but filled with passion. Marcus tapped his pen against the table. "You've got the heart, Shaq. But investors? They want numbers, not feelings." Shaq grinned. "That's where you come in, Marcus. You know the game. Help me sell this." Over the next week, Shaq and Marcus worked tirelessly, refining the proposal. They crunched numbers, outlined the potential for returns, and created a presentation that highlighted not just profitability, but purpose. Keisha, initially doubtful, found herself inspired as Shaq's determination infected everyone involved. While Marcus dug into the building's records, he stumbled across a surprising revelation. Grayson wasn't doing as well as he let on. "Shaq," Marcus said during a late-night call, "the guy's drowning. He's been slapped with lawsuits from tenants, and he's barely keeping the place afloat with patchwork repairs and shady deals." Shaq smirked. "So, he's vulnerable." "Very," Marcus replied. "If we come in with a solid offer, he'll bite. He probably thinks he's offloading a headache." Keisha, listening in, nodded. "Good. Let him underestimate us. It'll make the win even sweeter." The plan was set in motion. Shaq's team, with Marcus leading the negotiations, prepared a discreet offer to buy the complex. It wasn't flashy, but it was enough to grab Grayson's attention. "This is key," Marcus explained to Shaq and Keisha during a strategy meeting. "Grayson can't know you're involved. If he does, he might make this personal and refuse to sell out of spite." Shaq agreed. "Keep my name out of it until the ink is dry. I want him blindsided." The offer was submitted, and within days, Marcus received a response. Grayson, cocky as ever, had agreed to discuss terms. Even as the deal moved forward in secret, Shaq wanted to connect with the tenants. Disguising himself in a baseball cap and hoodie, he visited the complex again. This time, he wasn't just observing, he was listening. In the dimly lit hallways and cramped apartments, tenants shared their stories. An elderly woman spoke about her fear of eviction every month. A single father described the unsafe playground that his kids avoided. A young artist revealed how she had to fight constant rent increases just to stay in her studio apartment. Shaq's heart ached with every story, but it also fueled his resolve. As he left the complex that evening, he called Keisha. "This isn't just a business move," he said. "This is a mission." Keisha smiled on the other end of the line. "And you've got an army behind you, Shaq. Let's make it happen." Grayson sat back in his leather chair, smirking as he reviewed the offer Marcus had sent over. "Finally," he muttered, tapping his pen against the desk. "Someone with enough cash and stupidity to take this nightmare off my hands." The deal seemed too good to be true. A solid price, no questions asked, and a buyer willing to take on all the building's liabilities. Grayson, blind to the strategy unfolding behind the scenes, only saw an opportunity to escape the mess he'd created. "Let them deal with these whining tenants and endless maintenance complaints," he said smugly, signing the initial agreement. Days later, Marcus met with Grayson to finalize the details. Grayson strutted into the meeting, his confidence oozing through every move. "You know," he began, sitting across from Marcus, "you're getting a real fixer-upper here. This place is, let's just say, not for the faint of heart." Marcus smiled politely, keeping his cards close. "We're confident in what we're taking on, Mr. Grayson. The property has potential. It just needs a fresh start." Grayson chuckled. "Good luck with that. I've spent years dealing with these tenants. They're impossible to please. But hey, not my problem anymore." Marcus nodded, concealing his disgust. "We'll make it work." As the conversation continued, Grayson's arrogance grew. He spoke of the difficult residents and constant complaints, brushing off any responsibility for the building's state. Marcus, calm and composed, let him talk, knowing that every word further justified Shaq's mission to take over. Finally, the papers were signed. Grayson leaned back, satisfied. "Well, congratulations. You've officially inherited the headache of the century. But hey, maybe you'll surprise me," he said with a sarcastic grin. Marcus shook his hand, hiding his satisfaction. "We'll see, Mr. Grayson. We'll see." Little did Grayson know, the deal had already set the stage for his own downfall. While Grayson celebrated his victory, Shaq was back at the complex, getting to know the tenants on a deeper level. Dressed in his hoodie and sneakers, he blended in, sitting on stoops and sharing conversations with families, elders, and children. One tenant, a young mother named Jasmine, invited him inside her apartment. "I don't usually let strangers in," she admitted, "but you seem different." Her apartment was small and cramped, with peeling paint and a broken radiator. "This is what we've been dealing with for years," she explained, cradling her toddler. "Grayson's people never listen. They just threaten us when we complain." Shaq listened intently, taking mental notes. Jasmine wasn't the only one with horror stories. In another apartment, Mr. Hernandez, an elderly veteran, spoke about the broken elevator that forced him to climb 5 flights of stairs daily. "I've lived here for 20 years, he said, his voice heavy with frustration. "Grayson used to promise fixes. Now he just ignores us." Shaq's resolve deepened with every story. Meanwhile, Keisha wasn't sitting idly by. She'd taken it upon herself to interview tenants and gather evidence of Grayson's negligence. Armed with a notebook and a camera, she documented everything: the cracked walls, unsafe staircases, and garbage piling up in the alley. "This isn't just about bad management," she told Shaq one evening. "This is neglect. It's cruelty." Shaq agreed. "Then let's make sure that cruelty ends with us." As Shaq and Keisha prepared for the transformation, Grayson remained blissfully unaware of their plans. He visited the complex one last time to collect his belongings, strolling through the courtyard with an air of superiority. "Good riddance," he muttered under his breath, ignoring the glares from tenants. "This place is someone else's problem now." He had no idea that the man he once belittled was about to undo everything he'd built and replace it with something far better. The day of the reveal arrived with a buzz of anticipation in the air. Shaq's sleek black SUV rolled into the apartment complex, drawing the curious stares of tenants who remembered the commotion from his previous visit. This time, Shaq wasn't dressed in casual clothes. He stepped out in a sharp navy suit, exuding authority and confidence. Behind him, his team followed, carrying documents and plans for the future. Residents began whispering among themselves, trying to piece together why he was back, and looking so official. As tenants gathered near the courtyard, Shaq made his way to a small podium that had been set up earlier. His towering frame commanded attention, and the room grew silent as he raised a hand to speak. "Good afternoon, everyone," he began, his deep voice carrying warmth and reassurance. "I wanted to come back here today to share some exciting news." The crowd leaned in, eager to hear what he had to say. Grayson arrived moments later, his face twisted in confusion. He'd stopped by to collect a few remaining personal items, but seeing the crowd and the man who had caused trouble last week made his stomach churn. "What's going on here?" he muttered to no one in particular, his tone laced with irritation. Shaq turned his attention to the tenants, ignoring Grayson's arrival for the moment. "A few weeks ago, I had an experience here that stayed with me," he said, his voice steady. "It reminded me of why I work hard and why I care so much about the communities I come from." The tenants nodded, many recalling the unjust treatment Shaq had faced at Grayson's hands. Finally, Shaq turned toward Grayson, who had pushed his way to the front. "You," Grayson scoffed, crossing his arms. "What are you doing here? Haven't you embarrassed yourself enough?" Shaq didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped closer to the man who had humiliated him. "Actually," Shaq said calmly, "I'm here because this complex is mine now." The crowd gasped. Grayson's face turned pale, his smug expression evaporating in an instant. "What?" he stammered, his voice shaking. "You heard me," Shaq replied. "I'm the new owner of this property, and I'm here to make sure it becomes a place where people feel respected, safe, and valued, something you clearly failed to do." Grayson sputtered, searching for a retort, but none came. His confidence crumbled as Shaq continued to address the tenants. "Starting today, things are going to change," Shaq declared. "We're lowering rents, fixing everything that's been ignored, and making this complex a home for everyone. Not just a paycheck for someone who doesn't care about you." Cheers erupted from the tenants. Some clapped, others hugged each other, and a few wiped away tears of relief and joy. For years, they'd suffered under Grayson's neglect and greed, and now they finally had someone on their side. Grayson, overwhelmed by the scene, tried to slip away unnoticed, but Shaq stopped him with a parting remark. "Next time, remember, respect isn't optional, and you never know who you're dealing with." Grayson, his face red with embarrassment, stormed off without another word. As the crowd celebrated, Shaq stayed behind to talk to the residents, shaking hands and answering their questions. Keisha stood beside him, beaming with pride. "You did it," she whispered. Shaq smiled, but his focus was on the people around him. This wasn't just a victory for him, it was a victory for them all. The transformation of the apartment complex began almost immediately after Shaq's announcement. The very next morning, the tenants woke up to the sound of trucks pulling into the parking lot and teams of contractors surveying the property. What was once a neglected, crumbling building now felt alive with possibility. Shaq stood in the courtyard with Keisha, clipboard in hand, as he directed the contractors. "We're starting with the basics," he said. "Fix the plumbing, repair the elevators, and repaint the walls. These people deserve better, and we're going to give it to them." His tone was firm, but there was a warmth in his words that reflected his genuine care. The contractors got to work, ripping out broken pipes, rewiring faulty electrical systems, and patching up leaks that had been ignored for years. The once gloomy hallways began to brighten, and the tenants noticed the change. Elderly residents, who had long struggled with the broken elevators, now smiled as they saw workers fixing them. Parents pointed to the freshly painted walls and told their kids, "See? Things are getting better." Shaq didn't just want to fix the building, he wanted to build a sense of community. He and Keisha hosted weekly meetings with the tenants in the courtyard. They listened to their stories, complaints, and suggestions. At first, the tenants were hesitant. Years of neglect had made them wary. But as the repairs continued and Shaq's promises turned into action, they began to trust him. One evening, during one of these meetings, A young single mother named Vanessa spoke up. "I've lived here for 5 years," she said, her voice trembling. "I've had to deal with mold, broken heaters, and constant rent hikes. But this is the first time I feel like someone actually cares." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Shaq nodded. "You deserve better," he said simply. Keisha played a crucial role in the transformation. She spearheaded the idea of creating a communal garden in the unused backyard space. "It's not just about fixing things," she explained to Shaq. "It's about giving people a reason to come together." With her leadership, the tenants planted flowers, vegetables, and herbs. Watching the garden grow became a source of pride for everyone, especially the children. As the physical repairs progressed, Shaq focused on rebranding the complex. He renamed it Shaq's Haven, a name that symbolized safety, belonging, and pride. A local artist was commissioned to paint a mural on the side of the building, a vibrant piece depicting people of all races, ages, and backgrounds coming together. The tagline, "Where everyone belongs," was added beneath the mural in bold letters. Inside the complex, Shaq worked to highlight the diversity of the tenants. He organized cultural nights where residents could share their food, music, and traditions. These events brought people together in ways they had never experienced before. Even the kids, who once played separately in small cliques, began to bond over shared games and activities. One of the most touching moments came when Shaq visited a small apartment occupied by an elderly man named Mr. Jenkins. The man had been living in squalor, his apartment plagued by leaks and peeling paint. When Shaq saw the conditions, he immediately ordered a complete renovation of the unit. A week later, Shaq personally escorted Mr. Jenkins back to his refurbished apartment. The old man's eyes filled with tears as he looked around at the fresh paint, new furniture, and repaired fixtures. "I've never lived anywhere this nice," he said quietly. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was emotional. The tenants began to see themselves as part of something bigger. They started taking pride in their homes, organizing cleanup drives, and volunteering to help each other. What had once been a place of despair was now a thriving, hopeful community. By the end of the month, Shaq's Haven had become unrecognizable. The building gleamed with fresh paint, the garden was in full bloom, and the tenants walked with a newfound confidence. As Shaq stood in the courtyard one evening, watching children play and neighbors chat, Keisha turned to him with a smile. "This is more than just a building now," she said. "This is a home." Shaq nodded, his heart full. "This is just the beginning," he replied. Word spread fast about the transformation of Shaq's Haven. Tenants couldn't stop praising the changes, and local media outlets began highlighting the story of a once-neglected complex turned into a thriving community space. While the residents basked in their new reality, one person wasn't celebrating. Grayson. Sitting in his dimly lit office, Grayson scrolled through his phone, his jaw tightening with every headline. "Shaq transforms apartment complex into community haven, and new owner restores dignity to forgotten tenants," screamed from the screen. He threw his phone onto his desk, muttering, "It's all just for show. Let's see how long it lasts." But it wasn't just the headlines eating at him. Grayson's name was beginning to surface in stories about the mistreatment of tenants. Former residents started coming forward, sharing horror stories of how they had been evicted unfairly, charged exorbitant fees, and forced to live in unsafe conditions. Tenant advocacy groups picked up the cause, calling for investigations into Grayson's management practices. The backlash wasn't just public, it was personal. Vendors and contractors Grayson had worked with for years began cutting ties with him. Even his social circle, once full of other wealthy property owners, started avoiding him. At a dinner party, he overheard whispers. "Can you believe how he ran that place? And no wonder he had to sell." Grayson's reputation, once solid among his peers, was crumbling. Desperate to salvage what he could, Grayson decided to visit the apartment complex. He drove up in his luxury car, parking near the entrance. As he stepped out, he noticed how different the place looked. The once cracked walls were now freshly painted, the courtyard was filled with flowers, and a vibrant mural proudly displayed the words, "Where everyone belongs." Children played joyfully and tenants greeted each other with smiles. It was a stark contrast to the neglected state he had left it in. Grayson walked toward the office, his steps slower than usual. He wasn't greeted with respect or fear like he had been in the past. Tenants glanced at him but quickly turned away, whispering to one another. Inside the office, Shaq was reviewing some renovation plans with Keisha and Marcus. When Grayson entered, the room fell silent. Shaq looked up and raised an eyebrow, his expression calm but firm. "Grayson," he said, setting the papers down. "What brings you here?" Grayson cleared his throat, trying to muster some of his old arrogance. "I came to see how things are going," he said, his voice faltering. Shaq leaned back in his chair, studying him. "Things are going great, thanks to everyone who believed in creating something better." His tone was polite, but there was no mistaking the weight behind his words. Grayson shifted uncomfortably. "Look, Shaq," he began, his voice lowering. "I might have made some mistakes, but maybe we can work together. I've got experience in this business, and I think I could—" Shaq held up a hand, cutting him off. "Respect isn't something you can buy or fake, Grayson. You didn't just mismanage a property, you mistreated people, and that's not something I can overlook." Grayson opened his mouth to argue, but the look in Shaq's eyes stopped him. There was no anger, just resolve. Defeated, Grayson nodded and turned to leave. As he walked out of the office, Keisha shook her head. "He's got a long way to go before he learns," she muttered. Outside, tenants watched as Grayson climbed into his car. A few clapped softly as he drove away, a subtle acknowledgement that his reign was officially over. Grayson's departure marked a turning point for the complex. The tenants no longer felt like victims. They felt empowered. Under Shaq's leadership, they were finally building a community that thrived on respect and inclusivity. The transformation of Shaq's Haven was more than just a physical one. It was a revolution of spirit. The residents who once lived in fear of eviction now woke up each morning with a sense of pride. The complex had become a beacon of hope, and its story began rippling through the community like a wave of inspiration. Shaq walked through the courtyard one sunny afternoon, his towering presence drawing smiles and greetings from the residents. Children played basketball on the newly paved court, their laughter filling the air. Elderly tenants sat on freshly painted benches beneath shady trees, chatting as they watched the younger generation thrive. Keisha walked beside her brother, carrying a clipboard filled with ideas for upcoming projects. "You've done something incredible here," she said, her voice filled with pride. Shaq shook his head modestly. "We've done something incredible," he replied. "This was never just about me. It's about giving people a place to feel safe and respected." The community center, once an abandoned corner of the property, had become the heart of the complex. Inside, a group of tenants gathered for a financial literacy workshop led by Keisha. She spoke with passion, helping families understand how to budget and save for their futures. "Knowledge is power," she told the group, "and this community deserves all the power it can get." Meanwhile, Marcus oversaw a small team installing new security cameras around the complex. "Safety first," he said, grinning as Shaq passed by. The upgrades weren't just cosmetic. They were a promise to the residents that they mattered. Word of the transformation spread far beyond the complex. Local news stations covered the story, dubbing Shaq a hero for his bold and compassionate leadership. Interviews showcased tenants who shared heartfelt stories of how their lives had improved. One elderly woman, Mrs. Jenkins, said with tears in her eyes, "I thought I'd spend my last years in fear of losing my home. Now I finally feel at peace." Shaq's Haven became a symbol of change, drawing attention from activists, nonprofits, and even city officials. Inspired by Shaq's efforts, other property owners began reconsidering how they managed their buildings. Some even reached out to Shaq for advice, asking how they could replicate his success. Amid the growing recognition, Shaq remained grounded. During an interview with a popular talk show, he was asked about his motivation. "It's simple," he said. "Everyone deserves respect. Whether you're the owner or the tenant, we all have the same right to dignity. I wanted to create a space where people could thrive, not just survive." The tenants weren't the only ones transformed by the experience. Keisha, inspired by her brother's vision, started her own nonprofit to help struggling families find affordable housing. "Shaq gave me the confidence to dream big," she said during a community event. Even Grayson's shadow couldn't dim the light of Shaq's Haven. Though his reputation was in shambles, Shaq chose not to focus on the past. Instead, he poured his energy into building a legacy of positivity and progress. The story came full circle during a block party hosted at the complex. The courtyard buzzed with life, music, food trucks, and families dancing together under string lights. Shaq stood near the stage, watching the celebration unfold. A young girl approached him, holding a hand-drawn thank you card. "Thank you for giving us a home," she said shyly. Shaq knelt down, accepting the card with a warm smile. "Thank you for making this place special," he replied. As the evening wound down, Shaq and Keisha stood together beneath the new sign that hung proudly above the complex entrance. "Shaq's Haven, built for everyone." "I think Dad would be proud," Keisha said softly. Shaq nodded, his voice steady. "This is just the beginning." The screen fades to black as the sound of laughter and music fills the air, leaving the audience with one powerful message. When respect and kindness lead, transformation follows.